At 3:50 a.m. on October 6, 1973, on the day of the Yom Kippur fast, the holiest day of the year for Jews, when life in the country comes to a standstill, a telephone call woke up the head of the Israeli government, Golda Meir. The call was from her military secretary, Israel Meir, who reported an urgent notification from the head of the Mossad Foreign Intelligence Service, Zvi Zamir, who had traveled to London to meet with a high-ranking source. Zvi Zamir reported that Egypt and Syria are planning to jointly attack Israel. Soon the Prime Minister received a full report from the head of the Mossad. It was reported that the enemy would strike in the early evening of October 6. The military plans of Syria and Egypt were described in some detail. The Israeli army begins mobilization. The enemy struck a little earlier, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The war came as a surprise to the Jewish leadership. Israeli intelligence services knew about the redeployment of the Arab armed forces and more than once received warnings about a possible attack, but they were mistaken in their assessment of what was happening. On the one hand, this was caused by competition between the Mossad and military intelligence. On the other hand, with the position of the political leadership, bet on revenge. Completely different moods reigned in Arab society. The crushing defeat in the Six-Day War caused a crisis in the idea of Arab nationalism and Arab unity. The development of political Islam, including its radical movements, begins. The war brought disappointment and a feeling of disaster. This was especially noticeable in Egypt, which claimed to be the leader of the Arab world. Anwar Sadat, who became president of Egypt in 1970, tried to revive Egypt's importance in the Arab world, and to do this, intended to take revenge for the humiliating defeat in the Six-Day War. Sadat refused military assistance to the USSR and began rapprochement with the United States. At the same time, Egypt retained the military potential created with the help of Moscow. The Arabs had a serious military advantage. The total strength of the Egyptian and Syrian armed forces was approximately 750,000 people, and with the participation of Allied troops, over 1.1 million people. Israel deployed 375,000 soldiers at the beginning of the campaign, and 415,000 after general mobilization. The Egyptian Air Force had 550 aircraft, the Syrians 310, and the Israelis 480. The Arabs also had tank superiority. 2,000 new Soviet tanks from the Egyptians, plus 1,200 from the Syrians. The Israeli tank forces had 1,700 vehicles, many of which were outdated models. The Arabs had more than double superiority in guns and mortars, and triple superiority at sea. Arab Blitzkrieg. The beginning of October 1973 became the most terrible days in the history of Israel. It seemed that the Jewish state was over. Cairo and Damascus prepared the operation well. Israel was beaten from two sides, on the Egyptian and Syrian fronts. Detachments of Iraqis, Jordanians, Libyans, Moroccans, and Algerians also entered the war. Pilots from Pakistan fought against Israel. The Arabs have well learned the lessons of 1967, the developments of Soviet advisors, and studied the experience of the enemy himself. They were perfectly armed with the best military equipment from the USSR in the world at that time. They were able to strike suddenly and seize the initiative. The Egyptians struck through the Suez Canal, swept away the weak enemy defenses, and broke into Sinai. It was a classic operation of the era of industrial states. Massive artillery preparation, tank wedges from hundreds of tanks. Soviet Mi-8 helicopters land Egyptian troops behind enemy lines, demoralizing the Jews and disrupting communications. Israel is losing air supremacy. The enemy has powerful air defense. For the first time in battle, Soviet mobile air defense systems of the Cube-type, anti-aircraft self-propelled guns Shilka, man-portable missile systems Strela 2. The Jews did not have time to preemptively strike Egyptian airfields, and their air force was forced not to seize air supremacy, but to make sorties to save their ground forces and strike enemy positions and columns. Here, the Jewish Air Force ran into heavy fire from Arab air defenses and suffered heavy losses. At the same time, Israel attacked Syrian troops in the Golan Heights. Heavy fighting began there. The Israelis were being pushed back. The Syrians were able to fire at Israeli territory. The situation was critical. On each front, the enemy had a noticeable advantage in forces and resources over the Jews. It seemed that Egyptian and Syrian troops would crush the Jewish state. The Israelis are trying to launch a massive attack on Egyptian troops in the Nile Valley, having assembled a strike force of 70 Phantoms. As in 1967, planes enter from the Mediterranean Sea, but now they were faced with strong air defenses built under Russian leadership. Jewish planes intercept the MiG-21. The Israelis lose 18 vehicles, shooting down 4 enemy vehicles. In attempts to suppress Syrian air defenses and bomb airfields, the Israeli Air Force also suffers heavy losses. Before the start of the war, Israel had 99 F-4s, and about 55 were lost. The United States, in order to make up for these losses, delivered 52 Phantoms to Israel in 2 batches at the end of October. USA saves Israel. Israel was able to attract the United States to its side. The Americans are carrying out emergency deliveries of weapons by air. A powerful Jewish American, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, came out on Israel's side. He bluntly told Anwar Sadat, "America will not tolerate the defeat of Israel. And if Cairo wants to receive American investment, then there is no need to do anything stupid." As a result, the Egyptian troops, which had penetrated the Sinai Peninsula with the forces of the 2nd and 3rd Armies at 15 to 20 km, stopped on October 9 to 13. The Arabs began to gain a foothold in the occupied territories, instead of developing an offensive, not allowing the enemy to come to his senses. Therefore, the Jews were able to come to their senses, regroup their forces, and launch a counter-offensive. The Israelis regained previously lost positions and then struck themselves. Egypt is losing strategic initiative. Israeli blitzkrieg. On October 15, the Israeli army went on the offensive on the Sinai Suez front. The main blow was delivered to the 2nd Egyptian Army, which held the left flank. The Israelis reached the Great Bitter Lake, which is located between the northern and southern parts of the Suez Canal. The solid front of the Egyptian troops was torn by this lake. This lake became the key to the victory of the Israeli troops. On the evening of October 16, several amphibious tanks and amphibious armored personnel carriers crossed the lake and created a bridgehead behind enemy lines. For some reason, the Egyptians slept through the enemy landing. They thought it was impossible. According to them, the Jews had no means of transportation. The next night, another 30 tanks were transported to the other side, and the bridgehead was expanded. The Israelis then transported another 60 tanks to the East Bank. On the night of October 19, the Israelis built 2 floating bridges across the Great Bitter Lake and transferred new infantry and tanks. Sharon's mobile groups looked for weak points in the rear of the Egyptians, and from the rear, they destroyed the positions of air defense systems, artillery, headquarters, and rear bases. Panic began among the Arabs. Israeli aviation supported the strike force from the air. The Arab air defense was noticeably weakened by the actions of mobile groups. The Israelis took a big risk. The crossings could be destroyed by Arab air forces and artillery. Sharon's troops would have been completely surrounded, deprived of the supply of fuel and ammunition. However, a miracle happened again. Egyptian President Sadat ordered a stop to the massive artillery shelling of the crossings that had begun, and the Egyptian Special Forces Brigade, aimed at destroying the pontoons, received a strict ban from Cairo to carry out this operation. As a result, the Israelis successfully defeated the enemy's rear and blocked the 3rd Egyptian Army. Soon 300 Israeli tanks crossed the Suez and prepared to rush to Cairo. Cairo began to play giveaway. Egyptian President Sadat caved in under Kissinger's pressure and did not dare to win. He didn't have enough will to finish off his opponent. He wanted to receive American financial assistance of $2 billion annually to rebuild the country's economy. It is clear that this helped him and other Egyptian dignitaries get rich. It is worth noting that Moscow, which at that time was intensively arming Egypt and Damascus, on October 9 to 22, an average of 30 planes with Soviet equipment arrived per day, also insisted on peace. The USSR did not want the defeat of Israel. At the same time, Washington and Moscow were negotiating the possibility of a ceasefire. Kissinger flew to Moscow. Both sides urged Cairo to stop. At the same time, from the very beginning of hostilities, it was proposed that everyone remain in the territories occupied at the time of the conclusion of the ceasefire agreement. At first, this did not suit Israel at all. Damascus took the toughest position. Therefore, according to some sources, the Syrians received a warning that if they crossed the Jordan, the Israeli army would launch a nuclear attack on Damascus. As a result, Sadat caved in and asked for a truce. On October 22, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution No. 338 on a ceasefire and called for the implementation of the resolution of November 22, 1967. Israel continued fighting. Then Moscow exerted military political pressure on the United States and Israel. The USSR warned Israel of the most severe consequences if it continued aggressive actions against Egypt and Syria. At the same time, Brezhnev sent an urgent telegram to Nixon, in which he assured the American side that if it was passive in resolving the crisis, the USSR would be faced with the need to urgently consider taking the necessary unilateral steps. Moscow is preparing airborne divisions for deployment to the conflict zone. Israeli troops stopped their offensive, and the war ended on October 25. On January 18, 1974, at the 101st kilometer of the Cairo-Suez Highway, in the presence of the American delegation, Egyptian representatives signed an agreement with the Israelis on the disengagement of troops. Israel withdrew its troops 32 kilometers from the Suez Canal. On May 31, a similar agreement, but with the mediation of the USSR and the USA, was signed by Israel and Syria. Part of the Golan Heights with Quneitra was returned to Syria on the terms of demilitarization and the deployment of UN troops here. The fighting continued for almost 3 weeks. During this time, 2.5 to 3,000 Israeli soldiers were killed. 7 to 9,000 were wounded. Several hundred people were taken prisoner. Data on Arab losses vary greatly, from 8.5 to 9 to 18,000 dead, from 19 to more than 50,000 wounded, 8 to 9,000 prisoners.